Hello, everyone, and welcome to this advancing practice session about the FASB changes. Those changes, of course, happened pre-COVID, so they feel like a long time ago. But they're really important and multifaceted, and I'm really glad to welcome Gina McDonald from FMA back to the Advancing Practice program to help us revisit those important FASB changes and just check in about, from your experience in your practice, how nonprofits are doing, whether those changes have had the kinds of impacts on analysis, both internal to organizations and external by funders and others that perhaps FASB hoped for or anticipated, and some nonprofits hoped for and some worried about, right? So we're excited to just take the pulse and check in on that. Gina, who many of you know, is a lead consultant and a CPA at FMA. She's been there, I think, about 6 years, and before that had 17 years in public accounting, including an emphasis on nonprofits and government agencies. So it's wonderful to have your expertise, and I know your particular passion is around making financial data useful to executives and senior managers and board members, and of course, a lot of these issues are about presentation and what kind of analysis is possible when we implement these FASB changes. So it's right up your alley, and we're glad to have you here to speak with us about it. There is a hashtag for today's conversation, which is FASB Update. So we welcome your ideas and thoughts as you follow along if you're on social media. You have a Q&A box here on Zoom, and that's what I'm going to be moderating throughout the session. So you can enter questions as they arise for you, and I'll be tracking on those. Gina's also put in some natural breaks between content areas. Well, I'll be sure to check in and see if there are clarifying questions at those moments. As always, the session is being recorded. You will get the recording along with the slides in a couple of days from the NPQ team, so not to worry about that. And Gina, again, welcome. Thank you for being here. And I'm going to turn it over to you on the next slide to sort of recap how we got here and where we're going to go today.
Great. Hi, everybody. Hi, Jean. Thanks for having me with you for the next hour. Jean and I were talking about it feels good to have a little change in our focus these days and talk about maybe something a little bit different. And so let's start with really setting some context as to why we want to spend our time recapping what's really the not so new nonprofit financial reporting changes together today. Because really we want to acknowledge that many of us are in the midst of dealing with the major health crisis, resulting financial crisis affecting a lot of our organizations. So why do we feel like this is a moment to stop and also take an hour and talk about this topic? As Jean mentioned, we continue to believe there's value in revisiting and recapping these accounting standards updates, the timing of which we see here on our screen. So we know that this accounting standards update, or ASU for short, as it indicates here, was the first major change in nonprofit financial reporting in 25 years. So at that moment in time, 2 or 3 years ago, we really thought this was the biggest deal happening. And so many of us now either have reported our nonprofit financials to the outside world in this new way, maybe one time for fiscal 19, maybe 2 times for calendar 18 and for calendar 19. So we're living it right now. We think it's valuable to continue to recap, discuss what the implementation looks like. What do the reporting changes mean for us? What has the new reporting model meant to stakeholders, maybe who were looking at our financial information? How then going forward can we analyze this information, not only during the time of continuing, say, more normal or regular operations, but also how can it help us now during this crisis management scenario planning? So really that's why we think it's important. So let's remind ourselves what has changed, in particular because we're living with it right now. So what did change? If you recall, this accounting standards update did not change accounting. So interesting point of reference. But it did change our financial statement presentation. So the look and feel of our financial statements. We'll take a peek at that just to remind ourselves what happened with that. And it also increased our disclosures. So if we're talking about our, say, audited financial statements or our reviewed financial statements and all of those footnote disclosures that we know are so important, those were affected as well. So really, we're going to think about, these are financial statements that go to the outside world. Who's reading them? What decisions are folks trying to make with our financial information that we're putting forth? So perhaps many of us give funders, prospective grantors, our audited financial statements. And so what can they glean from that information? What's reported there? Maybe many of us are thinking right now about financing or a loan application. So what are those financial statements going to say to those folks? And of course, many of us post our financial information, say on our website, just provide it to the public in general. As now we're in a different mode of fundraising, what will that mean? So this is why we imagine it's important for us to really think about this. What does the information say? So that we can have, say, a financial story that we are well versed in to share with others and to talk about. So in particular, what are we going to talk about? Well, let's just recap briefly then. There were 5 high-level provisions of this accounting standards update. We're going to focus on the 3 that we have highlighted here. So we're going to spend our time refreshing our memories as to what changed in relation to net asset classification. What changed? What were the additions that now we have to disclose in regards to our liquidity and availability? What does that look like? And what about expense reporting? So those are the 3 that we're going to talk about. Again, what did implementation mean for us? How can we use the info? We're not going to discuss today in our hour together changes to the presentation of our cash flow statement. We're also not going to talk about, but we want to mention briefly, the fact that we're not going to talk about some changes in the way we report investment return. Certainly, if that was an area that was important to you, you are well aware of the fact that it has to deal with underwater investments. A moment in time, which again, might also be another very real moment for some folks where we have investment or an endowment. And right now, maybe with what has been happening with markets, we may have cost basis that is, that is, say, more than market value. The market has fallen. So if we've not dealt with those implications before, maybe for the new reporting year, that investment return disclosure underwater endowment may actually become meaningful for us for the first time. So just also wanted to mention that. So then let's get into a little bit of a recap around net asset classification, remind ourselves what these changes look like. So we know that we had really a new language. We had some new wording, some new labeling. And that's really what we're talking about in terms of a different way to think about net asset classification. Why did FASB, who's the body who makes these accounting rules, why did FASB think that, 25 years later, now was the moment to change up some language? And we want to make it clear that when we see things like in the olden days of 2 years ago, unrestricted, temporarily restricted, or permanently restricted. We have new language now, either with or without donor restrictions. It was really clear that there was an external party who was restricting. And this was FASB's intention, is to let folks who are reading your financial statements know that there are external restrictions, not internal designations. There was less financial flexibility around net assets with donor restrictions or revenue that carries some kind of a donor restriction. So we can start to understand and remind ourselves it was a way to tell the outside world what we really have control over and what someone else is guiding in terms of the way we spend our dollars. Now, while this was meant to provide more clarity, some folks said, well, gee, we had this potential 3 different categories here of describing either our revenue or our net assets, and we just boiled it down to 2. So how does that give me more information? And so certainly the idea was not to hide details or not to provide less information. This was about clearer words. So this was clearer language, calling out donors are the ones restricting. Donors is a broad term that means lots of different external parties who are contributing to us. Furthermore, to address the issue of some folks saying, well, gee, it seemed to provide less info, we want to remind ourselves that we have options in presentation. So we have flexibility. We can disaggregate our information, meaning we have to, at a minimum, have 2 categories as we see here. We have to have a without donor restrictions category. If we have some transactions that carried external restrictions, we have to have 1 more category. But within each category, we could disaggregate. So we just have to be careful not to use our old language, not temporarily or permanently restricted, but we could describe what was in each of those categories in an explicit way right on the face of our financial statements. So maybe what we used to call unrestricted, maybe we simply changed the label and we called it without donor restrictions. And then maybe we went even further and broke down what used to be our unrestricted into maybe undesignated, meaning, hey, the board has not even put any internal, earmarking on these dollars. Maybe we do have some internal reserves. And so we could start to carve out what are the different components of what used to be our unrestricted, now is without donor restrictions. And then similarly, we could then have carved out and disaggregated, shown more detail in the with donor restrictions category. To illustrate that, and I know for some of us, this may be teeny tiny numbers depending on what kind of device we're looking at. So I'll just let you know the numbers here are not important. It's really just high level, what does disaggregation look like maybe on our balance sheet or our statement of financial position. So this is your net asset section at the bottom of your balance sheet. In our smaller box, we simply have 2 rows. Again, they used to be unrestricted, temp restricted, or maybe it used to be 3 categories. Now we've got 2, with and without donor restrictions. In our larger box, we see, oh, okay, same bottom line number, same net assets, but we broke it out in a much more detailed way. These are both permissible. So you had an option to disaggregate. You did not have to right on the face of the balance sheet this way. So now we start to see that, well, later on, we're going to talk about the fact that there's also disclosure involved. So I either can do this on the face of the statement so it's clear. If I don't, I do have to report to this detail in my footnote disclosures. So again, it's not about hiding, it's actually requiring more information about who's making decisions around the way we can spend our dollars. So that was our balance sheet presentation. Similarly, we have our statement of activities or our income statement. We commonly call this our P&L. This is just, if we were to look at the headings on our statement of activities, what would the headings look like? And so we see here also a couple of different options. Maybe we used to have several categories of restricted either revenue or net assets. So here we see, well, we still could break out and have separate categories. In this case, we've broken out the donor restricted category into program restricted. Maybe we have an endowment. And so here we're just disaggregating in the top band. Down below, we have another option. We could organize our columns for our, what used to be unrestricted, and break out what is now our without donor restrictions, again, into maybe undesignated, maybe show our operating reserves. Lots of nonprofits even still have a restricted net asset category that's related to their fixed assets or property and equipment. So we still continue to see these things, and it's okay. We just have to make sure that we're just not using outdated language on the high level basis. So then we know what this was all about was providing, hopefully, clearer information about our revenue restrictions, about our net asset restrictions. There was a lot of press about this. Right? I feel like this was one of the provisions that folks were talking about. As we look at the other provisions, it seems though, and I'd love to hear your opinion as well, that perhaps this one was the least disruptive to our financial statements, because many of us likely had disclosed similar information before. Maybe it was labeling changes, maybe it was a little more footnote disclosure. So wondering if anyone had any significant changes in presentation. Also wondering if folks really felt like, gee, I had to disclose a lot more in my footnotes. One thing I want to point out is not only do you have to disclose in your footnotes in words the restrictions from an external perspective, what are the donor restrictions? There was a requirement, or there is and exists today a requirement to actually disclose more about our board designated net assets. So actually FASB says people want to know what your board is earmarking. What are the, do you have policies around that? How did they decide, what to put aside, when to release that? Do you have a policy provisions around board designated? So that's, maybe that was what was new for you. Do some of you feel like there was less clarity? And also wondering if you've had any implication from external stakeholders along any of those lines.
Great, and we certainly welcome comments and questions in the question box. It doesn't have to be a question. It can be some data along the lines of what Gina's positing here. One thing that strikes me is there is an assumption about people reading footnotes in this whole FASB change, right? So there was an assumption before that people could learn what the distinctions were between unrestricted, temporarily restricted, and permanently restricted. And my experience was that it was the distinction between temporarily and permanently that was hard for lay people to get, to your point, because it doesn't really mean anything in lay language. And so this is perhaps a clarification of that. That said, things, unless you disaggregate like you showed on the previous slide, all of that information gets captured in the footnote, which means that a program officer or a prospective board member is reading and understanding footnotes. That's still a big assumption, isn't it?
Yeah, I would say it was a good opportunity, to your point, to remind folks the footnotes have a lot of important information, and that maybe it was a way to say, we know it might have been confusing before, but here is some new language, and to open up a conversation about it. Mm-hmm. I think it's interesting, and I don't know what anyone else thinks, that certainly this was the one that we heard about the most in terms of the new provisions. We would hear things from folks like, temp restricted is going away. So it's interesting that these concepts did not go away, they still exist. And our accounting didn't change, all of the careful tracking we have to do didn't change. We had some new language. This got the most press, but again, seemed like it was the least disruptive. And maybe that's because folks might have been over complying. They may have had lots of information in the footnotes, just recognizing this is a good idea. But now we just have guidance that says, well, if you weren't doing it before, you do have to put in a lot of detail. So it could be that as well.
Yeah, thank you. There's also a question about, has there been discussion of this mirroring the 990? Did this change get us out of sync with the 990 presentation? I don't know if that's something you can address.
Sure. So interesting question about the 990. 990 continued to use old language. I've not seen an updated form that says anything like donor restrictions or anything like that. There is a small place on the balance sheet in your 990 where you can break out net assets. But when it comes to, say, presenting revenue on your 990, it's all of your revenue, everything combined. 990 doesn't really, on the revenue side, allow you a place to say, well, this was my revenue that was restricted and this was my without donor restrictions. So 990 still combines revenue. There's a little bit of opportunity on the balance sheet to break out net assets. 990 really doesn't have that kind of a view. When we look at expenses in a moment, we're going to see expenses is one area that, interestingly enough, IRS was a little bit ahead of the curve in always having a certain requirement around expenses.
Thanks.
Yeah. So it seems like we should then take a peek at the expense reporting requirements, really as our next natural progression, as we spend a little bit of time talking about revenue. So we're reminding ourselves here that we are all nonprofits now are required to report expenses in at least 3 high-level functional categories: program, management in general, and fundraising. And so this was what we were just alluding to, in that the 990 always had our functional expenses within. So it was a weird moment where not every single nonprofit either had to present, as it notes here, a separate, say, schedule or statement of functional expenses, or give that level of activity anywhere in their full GAAP basis set of financials. Previously, only voluntary health and welfare organizations had that requirement. But if you were not one of those kinds of organizations, you could have had your audit present expenses not by these 3 categories, and then really have to present it only on your 990, because 990 always had this breakdown. So that was interesting. Now we're aligned. Now audits all have this detail. And here, again, we have flexibility in our presentation. So we can notice that we have 3 options. We can either present expenses by both nature and function, and we'll take a peek at what it might look like in a minute, either on the face of your statement of activity. So right on your income statement, you could include all of this detail. I've not seen anybody do it. Looks like it would be a lot of info on one page, but we have options. We could include the detail of our functional expenses in our footnotes. So footnotes count. So reminder, footnotes are part of the basic financial. So something in your footnotes counts. Or we can include a separate statement of functional expenses, which is the way most organizations go. So we have that whole page of expenses. The part that a lot of organizations, quite frankly, have been struggling with is the second item here, the requirement to disclose the method used to allocate expenses. Again, because this breakdown was in your 990, a lot of folks said, well, I do that anyway, I show that anyway. But this actually puts a focus on the methodology, the way we are spreading shared expenses. Really what we're talking about is telling folks how we decide what numbers to put in what columns. That's an interesting moment, because now as we look ahead to what might that report look like, or what does that page of numbers look like, again, numbers here not super important. We don't even have a lot of numbers to show. But really visually, what does the format here of the statement of functional expenses include? So we see down the left-hand side the natural expense classification. So reminder, this is where we start to see things listed that make sense to us in terms of what did we spend the money on. Here we see salaries. We then might have payroll taxes, rent, office supplies. So those are our natural categories, and we see all of those. But then it's interesting, we see the spread across into our columns. We see here this organization has 2 different programs. So they've listed a column for each program. They then also list management in general and fundraising, which those 2 combined are your supporting services. Supporting services is our preferred language. We also know it's also known as overhead, right? So that's what that is. So this is the moment that we know folks have interest in understanding how we are spending their dollars. Wouldn't it also be great if we looked at the total columns for each of these different functional areas to understand, well, what is the true cost of program A? In theory, if I got pretty good at figuring out an efficient allocation methodology and figured out a way to, again, effectively and efficiently spread my shared costs to all of the different functions that utilize those resources, what I would get here in my totals would be a representation of the true cost to provide those activities, a true cost of my supporting services. That's important information for us internally, isn't it? Understanding that we're trying to make decisions around programs. We need to know what programs cost, and we then compare that to what is the volume of those programs. Certainly, if we were running for-profit businesses, we would know this. We would know it to the penny because we do things in for-profits like try and price out our services. We're trying to make money. We're trying to cover the costs. It's important that nonprofits know this internally to attempt to cover costs of programs, useful in making decisions around program expansion, program contraction, funders asking us, how much do you need to do this or that? If this was a true representation of those costs, it would be useful in that way. And of course, we know folks look at this, externally and calculate ratios, look at our spending, and also there may be some judgment involved in opinions as to where we're spending dollars. So while many of us had to do this already, there was a little bit of a heightened focus because now FASB is saying everybody's required. And don't forget that additional requirement around disclosure, pretty much tell me how you know how to spread the shared cost. So tell me your allocation methodology. That's where a lot of organizations get a little bit hung up because, gosh, how do I describe that in words? Maybe it was a moment to refresh my allocation methodology. So wondering a couple of things, and happy to hear from all of you, either some opinions or questions, thoughts. Some thoughts that we had around functional expenses. We noticed that maybe not every single organization was allocating, going through that exercise of coming up with that functional, say, every month in their monthly internal financials. We still saw some organizations saying, well, my auditor does that for me. We do it just at year end for purposes of the audit. And so interesting to know what your experience might have been in that, or maybe Jean, what you've seen and heard. And so reminder that these are our financial statements, not our auditors. These are our numbers. We have the responsibility to have those numbers be accurate. It's our allocation methodology. So interesting when I might ask someone, hey, how do you spread shared payroll in this area? And someone says, oh, I don't know, my auditor has that spreadsheet. So the concept of it's not a spreadsheet, we can't look in a book and find a percent allocation. That's the right way to do it. It's us knowing where resources are utilized. We're best poised to come up with that methodology.
May I pop in here for a second?
Of course.
One thing that's coming to mind is the answer may be multifaceted. I might allocate a whole set of shared costs based on something like FTE, but then a separate set that I don't think really follow by FTE, where I'm using a line-by-line approach. And I'm wondering how auditors are responding to those hybridized models. I would think that's preferable. That means you're making a real judgment about what is the most accurate way to allocate certain expenses. We all know that something like square footage or rent may not lend itself to FTE if it's a space-intensive program, but not with a lot of staff, for instance. So I'm assuming it's okay, but it also, as you said, requires that we really have some language about, well, this set of expenses goes by number of people, this set of expenses is line by line based on our actual approximation of usage, et cetera. Is that what we're seeing, Gina?
Yeah, that's exactly right. So what we're saying is allocations by their nature are imperfect. Mm-hmm. So we have to, first of all, accept that it's not perfect, but we are trying to figure out an efficient and effective method that when we apply that method to those shared costs, gets the numbers in the right columns in a way that on an overall basis approximates where resources are utilized. So really that's our framework. So then to your point, we might say, well, it really is A, much more efficient, and B, pretty easy to allocate maybe all of my occupancy related expenses using square footage. Who's using what space? Definitely makes sense, easy to do. We can have that method for that group of expenses, and we could have another method for another group of expenses. We've also seen some organizations that say, well, I've really thought about this, and in an effort to be super precise, I want to take every single expense line item and have a different spread for it. So I guess we would think about that and think about, we might not be allocating at all at that moment. We may be actually specifically identifying, spending a lot of time. And so we want to question the efficiency and just understand, we know allocations are imperfect. And so what can we get that gets us a good view so that this information is reliable and it's permissible, and it may not be better either to try and do all that work to go line by line, right? So we do see that occasionally. Mm-hmm.
I also want to make the distinction, this isn't so much a question, but a comment, is the distinction between cost recovery, which you've talked about, you know, the for-profit analysis being pricing, we do pricing as well for when we do earned revenue, but also cost recovery in contracts and grants. And so the value of your fourth question here, I've got to get everything that's possibly related to that program in that column so I can say, look, this is how much it costs, whether I'm pricing it to a user or to a funder. That said, I just want to posit that I think I am a devotee of that, but I will say that as a leader, I also understood that there were times when that wasn't the right question. Our rent wasn't going to go down or up if I closed that program. And so I do think that there's this, for internal analysis, I think we have to have a flexibility and agility as leaders and people discussing the information to say, actually administration is a body of work. It is a vertical. It is going to be here. It's somewhat elastic to how many people we have and things, but in the course of decision making on a month-to-month basis, it's actually not. I'm not going to lay off my accountant because I'm thinking differently about program A. So I just want to lift up that there's a toggle between a cost recovery frame and a how do I organize this business frame. Do you know what I mean?
I know what you mean, and if it's okay with you, I just went backwards one slide just for a brief moment, just to have this framing for that conversation. You know, you've touched upon, I mean, it could be the elephant in the room. You said a toggle, the struggle. This is the real complication in that we also think about our expenses, and we have to think about our expenses, our costs in a couple of different ways. Sometimes we're asked, well, what is the definition of a program expense? It's a really, really short definition. A program expense is an expense related to the direct delivery of program service or the supervision thereof. It's that short of a definition. So, like you said, the accountant's job is to do accounting. The accountant does not, unless your accountant is out running programs, 0% of your accountant's salary ever goes in the program column here. That is the real complication in that, well, sometimes I get reimbursed by a grant for a portion of my accountant's salary. And we say, well, that's amazing because you just had a funder give you direct money for overhead. But that's the way to think about it. This is the true complication because, you know, we could spend lots of time talking about this is the tedious, complicated nature also of our accounting. Also gets us into thinking about, well, what record keeping system can I use? Can my record keeping system accomplish both that view of my functional and also help me to keep track of what I have to charge and allocate to grants and contracts for reimbursement. But they're two different things, to your point.
Yeah, and frankly, I think that the downside of the emphasis on allocation is that we don't visibilize the work of administration in particular, fundraising to some extent, but administration in particular, and how essential it is to high impact organizations. We want to spread them away. And so internally, what I'm advocating is that we need the ability to look at them before we spread them away, even if we're trying to teach people full costs. And so it's this real tension, not tension negative, creative and intellectual tension. And the answer is do both. Do what makes sense for the meeting or the retreat or the conversation, right? Keep your accounting system, be in charge of it, not a slave to it, right? What do we need to know? What do we need to know to have a conversation about? Do we have an administration that is best in class, that meets our true programmatic needs? That's a real conversation, in which case we want unallocated data, right? We want to see what it really takes to do administration. So appreciating that conversation, don't want to slow you down anymore.
No, not at all. I think we all recognize the importance of our infrastructure. And really that's what we're talking about, is knowing, what is our infrastructure cost? It's a real cost. It is supportive to programs, right? But just not the same as programs. So then let's get into the last of those three provisions we want to chat about. This one here, liquidity and availability disclosure, is what we at FMA saw as the most significant change in the new, not so new today, but new then, FASB reporting requirements. And so what we're saying is that there was a brand new disclosure. So again, another nod to, there is really important information in the disclosure, also letting you know that a lot of funders were clued into this. They were saying, hey, there's something new here. What is this all about? Let me pay attention to it. So also knowing that maybe some folks who hadn't looked at disclosures before were looking at them now for the first time. So reminder, what did the disclosure look like? There were two components. A qualitative component, so something written in words, maybe a couple of paragraphs, disclosing how our nonprofit is going to, and here it says, manage its liquid resources. Really, it was a disclosure describing how do we manage our cash flow? How do we figure out how to pay our bills? Like, how do we do it? What do we have as available liquid resources? Interestingly enough, though, 1 year into the future. So that is also why this disclosure was different from any single other thing in the financial statements. New way of thinking, because it was future focused. Everything else in your financials is about the past, what happened last year. This is, how are you going to do it next year? So we start to see how folks were envisioning using your information. Besides the description in words, we also have a quantitative calculation. So for sure, in our new financial statements and our audits right now, we have this calculation. Again, the way FASB described it is, you're going to calculate the availability of your financial assets to meet your cash needs for general expenditures within 1 year of the balance sheet date. That's a different way of saying, how are you going to pay your bills next year? Again, the numbers here are not the critical component, but just again, visually, many of us have this long and maybe a little shorter, maybe longer, new chart, new calculation in our footnote. Drives down to this bottom line that said something like financial assets available to meet cash needs. What do we have today? What did we have at our balance sheet date to pay bills for the future? So again, interesting, and brought up a lot of feelings for us, a lot of questions. Is there an implication that we should have enough money at the end of our current fiscal year to pay something next year? Was there any implication? Of course, FASB said, we're not trying to imply that. We're trying to, again, give users of your financial information something other than the balance sheet to look at. Because quite frankly, nonprofits, your balance sheets can be confusing. And sometimes we look at them and they look healthy, whatever that means. Looks like you have more assets than liabilities. Can you pay your bills? And quite frankly, a lot of organizations, we're going for donations, but we have lots of assets. What does it mean? A lot of people had questions. So this was an attempt to have a different forward-focused view. And again, this is an example that later on, when you download slides, you could read in more detail, but there is an opportunity here for us in our own words, because these are our financials, to describe what those numbers mean. So this organization said things like, we have seasonal variations in our cash flow. So now we start to see the opportunity we had here in this disclosure to call out seasonality, maybe to say something like, my balance sheet date, my year end, maybe that's a low point for me for cash. Maybe it's not, maybe it's a high point, but now I have a chance to talk in words. By the way, we also have a line of credit. Maybe we lean upon our line of credit during low times of cash. And then we maybe give some more context to that calculated number. Maybe we talk about the fact that we might have reserves that the board could release, things of that nature. So this was a true opportunity. And so when this new requirement came out, we had lots of conversation with folks that sounded something like, don't squander this opportunity to, in your own words, talk about what is on your balance sheet. So then that brings us to the question of, how did you do it? Did you take this opportunity to tell the world how you intend to manage cash flow? So a similar question as we had when we talked about the expense allocation. Who crafted this disclosure? It's future focused, not backwards looking. You're in charge of managing your own liquidity, not your auditors. So who did the calculation? Who crafted the disclosure? Did your auditor do it for you? Do you think that if you read it, it clearly articulates your story? Is it detailed enough? Do folks understand the story that it's telling? And again, we've found in practice that it was interesting. A lot of folks were worried about this. So we saw this requirement and we got nervous. What will it say about us? What will funders think? What if it shows zero and it shows I have nothing going into the year? Yet, I wonder in practice, we've not observed that folks perhaps took all the opportunities then to tell that story. So sort of wondering from you all what you've seen and heard in that regard.
Yeah, I mean, while people are entering their thoughts, which we'd love to hear, they don't have to just be questions. We're very curious how this one has played out for you over the last year plus. And to me, what's not said here is basically, the question is, what's your business model? That's what they're basically asking, because, if you're an organization that is prepaid for work, i.e. you're supported by foundations, or, then, you're going to have more available cash, on hand. And so like anything like this, I worry if the reader doesn't, or to your point, it's an opportunity to say, okay, here's what we have available, but here's our history. And here's where I think the history is really important. Yes, we live hand to mouth, if you must know. We're government funded, but we're $10 million hand to mouth, and it's been working for 50 years. Do you know what I mean? And so these numbers might look scary if you're looking at months of cash on hand, but we've survived for 40 years with 6 weeks of cash on hand. That's our business model, versus an organization who, that's not their business model and they're broke, right? It's how you articulate that in these disclosures, right?
Yep, absolutely, absolutely. I can imagine, as you're describing that, a disclosure that may describe the fact that this is how our contracts work, right? Someone could read your whole financial statement, look at your website, learn about all the things you do, and who besides accountants, maybe folks running nonprofits, Even think about things like we have reimbursement-based government contracts. We have to put out our own money, and 2 months later we might get reimbursed, right? It's, you know, the world does not know this. This is a chance to let folks know, hey, that does affect what our numbers look like. By the way, we've had these contracts for a long time. We're experts in the compliance. We don't feel that there's risk, but it affects cash.
That's right. I mean, liquidity it can be a sign of strength, i.e. good management, and it can also be a sign of your revenue model, you know, or both. And so the capacity to articulate that, your question about does our board understand, does our staff understand, I love that question because it starts with them. You might have a board member who on another board they serve on, the disclosure reads very, very differently, right? And they have to kind of realize, whoa, okay, we have a different revenue model. I have a different story to tell here. It's not that we're more or less well managed.
Yeah, and Jean, that really is in alignment to what we're saying here. And if we were to summarize the thoughts around liquidity, we recognize that liquidity was, and maybe is even more so today, just a basic business issue. For many nonprofits, it's very much tied to our ability to continue to operate. So at a basic level, we need to know this information. We need to know and understand our liquidity. We may also think about tracking it as a useful data point in our decision making. It tells us something about the future. So while we're saying FASB now is requiring the calculation, we are also reminded that others now have the opportunity to have a bird's eye view into that. And maybe if we haven't tracked this metric before, let's continue to use it as an opportunity to own it, analyze it on a regular basis. It's always helpful to understand our own trends when we're planning for the future. So our own trends are our best measure. And a lot of folks, look and say, well, what should it be? What's industry trend? What about other organizations like me? That's a hard question to answer. Your own trends, especially around this, and to your point, if you've done this for many years, your own trends are your best measurement. And this really is one of the really important data points, metrics, trends we can track and measure.
And I love your point about seasonality. So you asked me my cash position now versus, you know, in November. Does my board, or at least my finance committee, understand that our trends are not a straight line, right? It matters when you ask the question.
Yep, absolutely.
For some businesses, not for all, but for some businesses, it matters a lot, right? And really, what we're talking about is a lot of information that's helpful. It was helpful in the past. It's helpful for the future. Today, the moment we're in now, and we wanted to, of course, take a minute during our wrap-up time and relate the 3 financial reporting topics that we talked about to the real-life situation we find ourselves in today, trying to manage our finance during a crisis, during our COVID-19 management moment. So maybe how do what seems like mundane or unexciting things like net asset classification or functional expense or a required liquidity disclosure, how does it give us information that's useful insight in this moment? So first, we find it helpful to ground ourselves in what we're looking at here on our screen. So what we see before us is a basic scenario planning model. Every basic scenario planning model, and really lots of us now are in, rapid response, rapid changing scenarios here and trying to figure out what to do next. And next might be 2 weeks at a time, things are changing. Whenever we're in this scenario planning mode, we need to understand where we are. So step 1 in any scenario planning, budgeting, if you will, any financial planning is understanding your current financial position. Where are we now? The things we want to understand have something to do with net assets. So we talked about net assets here today. It's important planning now for the future. What do we have in restrictions? What are we carrying right now
are we going to be able to satisfy those donor restrictions in this moment where maybe I have ceased or curtailed programming? Is it something I'm going to pick back up again? If so, what is the timing of it? So again, really important that we were keeping good records and reporting always. FASB reminded us. Now we see that it's actually useful in this moment. Do I have to go to funders and ask for some changes in restrictions, extension of timelines? Where am I from a liquidity perspective? If I was not tracking and calculating my liquidity before, lots of folks are in this mode today. So it reminds us that this information is useful in our operations, useful in crisis management as well. So once I understand where I am, then in any scenario planning model, we try and figure out, well, what are my options going forward? What are some viable scenarios? And then we start to price out those scenarios based on different decisions I might have, right? If I start back up in a month from now, if I hire folks back, what does that look like? So we start to run our scenarios. We know, of course, we talked about functional expense allocation as being this FASB reporting requirement, but can we imagine now that if we are in a moment where we do not understand the true cost of our programs and we're having to make decisions about reducing programs 50%, if we had the number wrong and we think we're reducing by 50, maybe that won't be our cost savings because we didn't have the right data to make the decision about what level of reduction we're able to withstand right now. So we're saying the data in that, again, it's useful in our business management tool. And then, of course, we will act upon our scenarios. We'll pick a road, we'll go down that road, and then we'll have to look at really managing our cash flow closely. We then, of course, in any planning model, we may have to go back and retool the plan. So then we have to start, start on this model again when it's time to retool and replan. But it's a way for us to understand that, grounding ourselves in some of these basic concepts really has value even in this crisis management moment.
Absolutely. I can't imagine a board not wanting to dig all the way into the restrictions on those assets and whether they're self-imposed or not. We've had so much conversation on the MPQ platform in general about reserves and when to use them. And it's raised so many issues just about that question, about funder restrictions and can you get them unrestricted. A lot of the calls to action to foundations, for instance, have been to unrestrict gifts, right? And we've seen some do that, quite a few actually. Okay, well, how does that change my scenario planning? And when does that go through? Are they going to stick with that? Probably not in the next round, right? So really lining up those revenue changes and tappings of reserves with your expense planning is what I hear you saying.
Mm-hmm. Yep,
real
absolutely.
Quickly, a technical question. To be clear, the FASB change in this ASU was to make the reporting a requirement beyond just voluntary organizations. But the definition of what is program admin and fundraising did not change, right?
Correct.
Not that it's universally understood, but there was no new guidance about what constitutes one of those expenses. But I do want to underscore that there was new guidance that you had to disclose your methodology for allocation, which is a different point. I do want to say that I think that, we do sometimes use the word opportunity in the business that you and I are in. There's an opportunity to better understand and for your readers to understand. And the reality is we do have a lot of organizations that don't have the financial staffing capacity to seize that opportunity. I think that's, and I wonder if what you're seeing in your practice of people being able to self-administer these changes, or is it still auditors who are doing the work for more of our small or under-resourced organizations?
Yeah, absolutely. So certainly it's easy. I feel like it might be easy for me to say, write your disclosure. And certainly I was an auditor for a lot of years. I'm happy to write a disclosure. I could not imagine, right? We're not trying to make everybody be an auditor or an accountant. So maybe the approach is, if your auditor has written a first draft for you, now we can sit down for 15 minutes with the auditor and say, okay, let me read this. If it doesn't resonate with me and I'm the executive director, well, there's a potential issue there. This is now our opportunity to have the conversation and say, okay, I see what you've written. It's much easier to revise something that someone else has written than to write from scratch. I mean, this is universal, right? Give me something, I'll revise it and comment on it. And, you know, hey, auditor, okay, maybe we could describe this, or how about these words, or you forgot my line of credit. That's, you know, I know best how I do it. Now that I've got that outline, let me then try and put this in my own words, because you've given something, you know, that I can start with. I really think that could be a great approach.
Great. I know you want to show a resource on the next slide because we're needing to wrap up here. So what is this?
Sure. Yep, absolutely. So just to remind folks, if you have not visited strongnonprofits.org, it's a resource. It's maintained by FMA with support from the Wallace Foundation. It's a place where you can get many, many free tools, which include things like a program-based budget builder that can give you those functional expense columns, things of that nature. So please check it out and let us know, of course, what you think about it as you're working through any resources there.
Wonderful. Gina, this has been so helpful to reground and kind of reconnect to what the purpose of these changes were and to take the temperature of all of us on how we're doing and implementing them. So thank you very much for your time in preparing and presenting today. And thank you all for joining us.